I welcome the commissioning of the review by the Minister for Housing into funding for traveller-specific accommodation and the implementation of the traveller accommodation programmes, and followed a very useful meeting that we had, Minister, and I thank you for acting upon that. I understand that the Housing Agency report has been complete since July, but it remains unpublished. And I rely on leaked information from the Irish Times article published on the 14th of September, and which reported that traveller accommodation targets have not been fully met at any point since they were made mandatory on local authorities 18 years ago. The Irish Times article goes on to say that the leaked report concludes that anti-traveller prejudice at local authority level may be hampering progress. If the intention of government policy and the current legislation is that targets for traveller accommodation would be met in full and things would improve, it is clearly failing traveller women, children and men. The report commissioned by the Department of Housing finds that more than 55 million provided for traveller housing remains unspent since 2000, and just 68% of promised traveller accommodation units have been provided. All the while, travellers continue to live in shocking conditions, which I've seen myself at first hand. There is unacceptable overcrowding on halting sites. Figures from the department show that the number of traveller families in need of accommodation since 2000 has more than doubled. In this new leaked report, local authorities agreed overcrowding was an issue, leading to health and safety concerns, and all stakeholder groups agreed that the future assessment of the need for traveller families was unfit for purpose. The second anniversary of those who died in the Carrick Mines fire is coming up. More people will die in tragedies if these concerns aren't addressed. People will continue to live shorter lives in often housing-related ill health. I ask you, Minister, what will be done about all of that? According to the Census 2016, the traveller homelessness rate is 11 times higher than the general population. In the last 5 years, the rate of traveller homelessness has tripled. The leaked report also finds that the private rented accommodation provisions are extremely difficult for traveller families to access. Often discrimination and prejudice is getting in the way. People are rejected based on their names alone. It is a landlord's market, as you know. Yet some local authorities use private rented accommodation as the alternative to staying on a waiting list for travellers seeking access to traveller-specific accommodation. Figures show a rise from 162 families in 2002 to 2,222 in 2016. However, this has rendered increasing numbers of family homeless, fuelling the crisis further. Most traveller-specific and social housing in general is provided by local authorities using Part 8 planning process. But the leaked report further found that the most significant obstacle to the delivery of traveller accommodation is the planning process itself, particularly objections from settled residents and elected representatives, as you well know. I note and welcome the Minister's decision to review the Housing and Traveller Accommodation Act 1998. However, there must also be a reviewing of legislation which affects travellers in order to alleviate the crisis. For example, the recent amendment to the Planning and Development and Residential Tenancies Act of 2016, which facilitated developments of more than 100 accommodation units being dealt with directly by on-board Pleanála without going through local planning processes, could also indeed include traveller accommodation. Legislation should be introduced immediately to implement this change, and decisions to approve specific proposals for traveller-specific accommodation should be taken away from the local political system and invested in board Pleanála. There is at best systemic apathy and at worst prejudice in terms of meeting the accommodation of travellers. An indication of the apathy towards travellers and their accommodation is reflected in the participation in this leaked review, as you know, Minister, where only 26 out of the 31 local authorities responded to the survey, and only 22 were submitted with sufficient detail across all questions. Significant gaps were found in local authority reporting and inadequate data keeping. In some cases, there was no standardised recording, reporting and monitoring mechanisms. Indeed, the deadline for reporting to the Housing Agency, who you commissioned, was extended twice to facilitate poor responses. I ask you, Minister, to tell us when the Housing Agency review will be published and what your plans are to address the issue raised in the report and the major crisis for travellers and their housing needs. Thank you.